Here today, and just a couple of, I think, introductory comments. I think it's hard for any of us these days to sort of remember that just 15 years ago, newspapers were extremely dominant, nearly monopolistic sources of information in their respective communities. It was really the only place you could go for current events information. There was no such thing as on-demand access at that point. And even more so on the business side, they really had damn near monopolistic power in terms of their distribution and what they could charge for advertising. As we know, with the evolution of the internet, the business model and content model of newspapers has taken a very serious hit. On the business model side, they've lost the cash cow that was classified advertising. The whole circulation model, as they've moved online, just doesn't exist. And the advertising, the prices they could charge for advertising in print are not what they can charge in the online arena. So whether we like it or not, we are seeing the very slow shrinking of the newspaper model and newspaper institutions themselves. Particularly in this economic climate, it's highly likely we're going to see dozens of newspapers in the next year simply close up shop, as unfortunate as that might be. I think many of us are sanguine about the future. New models will evolve. Some of those institutions will figure out how to transform themselves into healthy online publications with reasonable workforces in the newsroom, but they will definitely be smaller. You can't. The most optimistic forecasts I've seen, and I've spent most of the last year studying this stuff, would tell you that an institution like the Washington Post, for instance, within 3 years will be, from an economic standpoint, about 2/3 its current size. That the steady decline of revenues on the print model, there's just no way that the online side will replace that revenue. The lines simply will not cross, not in any time in the near future. On the other hand, I think this is a time for enormous exploration and creativity in terms of what the new forms of news are. And I trust that Jim will talk about that as we go forward, because I think the future is not only about what the new models are, it's not only how we can leverage a longer tail of participation in gathering news, it's about new story models as well. What is news coverage? Is it the continuation of 1,500-word in-depth articles, or is it a combination of database orientations and so on that create, as I like to think of them, living resources of content on specific news topics? So it will be an exciting time to see that evolve. So we'll let Jim Brady talk to us a bit about that today. Jim comes from a mixed background of print and online. Started out at the Washington Post as a sports writer back in the late 80s and early 90s. Went over to AOL, spent some time there, and then came back to the Post in 2003, where he has been heading up the Washington Post Digital from an editorial and product perspective. And is justifiably proud of the work they've done. They won an Emmy for their reporting on Hurricane Katrina. That is the online product. And they're also very proud of a Knight Award they won, again, for new approaches in coverage with more orientation towards databases than simply narrative stories. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jim. He's going to ramble on and on and on for about 20 minutes. He asked me actually before he came, he says, does the Google audience have a sense of humor? And I said, well, that's really up to you, isn't it? So you can feel free to hold back your giggles and just really make them earn it. But then we'll open it up for discussion and questions and spend as long as you'd like. With that, Jim Brady.
Thanks. I will try to earn the laughs at some point. I'll give you a little bit of background just on the Post digital strategy, and because I've been involved in it for a pretty long time. I actually, pretty much ever since the Post has had a digital strategy, I've been there. I left for a little while for AOL, as Richard mentioned, but actually worked at the Post's first foray into new media, which was actually a paid dial-up model. If anybody out here remembers AT&T Interchange, well, then you really know a lot about your digital history. But most people, it is on the ash heap of history for all sorts of good reasons. But I personally, when I was in college in the late 80s, when I was working at the newspaper, writing sports, I got really obsessed with getting information when I wanted it, because I'm a New Yorker. I was down in DC going to school at American University. Back then, the Mets made the playoffs occasionally. And they were in the playoff hunt most every year. And as a kid living in Washington in 1991 or 1990, I didn't want to wait to find out how the Mets did it in the 11 o'clock news. I wanted that information right then and right there. So I got a CompuServe account when I was probably in '89. Piled on a whole bunch of other online services in the early 90s. And Richard and I have talked fondly of eWorld, which he worked on, which I actually was a member of. America Online, I had CompuServe, Prodigy. I played around in all of them just because I loved this idea that people could get information when they wanted it, however they wanted it. The problem was, at that point, if you worked in journalism, there was no practical application for that task. It was very much data-driven. There was no writing. There was no photography, no video. So you really, if you wanted to practice as a journalist, there really wasn't much you could do online at that point other than blow your budget by having 5 different online services. So I stayed at the Post. Was still doing sports 4 years later, actually 5 years later in late '94. And these folks that I'd never heard of from this new media subsidiary that we had started called Digital Inc. showed up at our door and said they were going to show us a new online version of the Washington Post. And this had been done so quietly that I didn't even know they were doing it. And they came and they showed off how they were going to communicate. Here's every story that's in the paper, the roster, the list of every player on the Redskins, everybody in Congress. And I remember seeing the presentation and thought, thank God I finally know what I'm doing next. Because at that point in my career, I was looking at a long career of being a copy editor in sports, which meant probably being unmarried forever. Because if you know how the hours copy editors work, especially sports copy editors, you work nights and you work weekends, and you don't really meet a lot of people. So my life was heading in a direction I didn't really want it to be in the print side. And I saw this opportunity that finally matched the ability to practice journalism with the online medium. So I ran over, grabbed the guy at the end of the presentation and said, if you have any jobs open over there, let me know. And about a month later, they called up and said, our sports editor just left. Ironically, to go to AOL. AOL and the Post have this strange sort of history in my life where I came to kind of go back and forth. So I went to the Digital Inc. And at that time, as I said, we were on this hideous dial-up proprietary network called AT&T Interchange with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and Ziff Davis and a couple of other portals that were essentially in this dial-up network. Has anybody actually heard of this thing? Yeah, okay, so one person. It was very short. Well, I'm surprised even one has, because it lasted for a very short period of time, and it was the only piece of software I've ever worked on where everybody just knew it was about the crash, and people would start screaming, save, 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 and it would just blow out. It was just a really crappy piece of software. But this is where we paid the price. The Post actually got into digital much earlier than pretty much any other newspaper in the country. The problem is we got in a little too early, because we launched this thing right at the end of the dial-up proprietary network bandwagon. Right as that was going off the cliff. The companies that actually waited another 6 or 8 or a year to actually launch went right to the web, which actually was the smarter move. But because we started early, we had this misfire. We ended up shutting this thing down and launching WashingtonPost.com in June '96. And I was there as sports editor and then as running the homepage for a couple of years. And so we weren't the first newspaper to launch online, unfortunately. We were one of the first ones to actually launch an online presence. So we kind of lost that battle. But in the early days, for us, the web was nothing but positive. If you look at who our real competitors have been in the newspaper space for a long time, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the difference between those 3 papers and us was that they had national distribution of the print product. We didn't. We had, thank God, thanks to Watergate and the Pentagon Papers and covering the world's global seat of power, the Post had a national and international name, but it didn't have the distribution to go with that. The New York Times, Journal, USA Today, anywhere you went, you could buy the paper. So for us, I think we were much more aggressive on the digital side than those 3 papers were, because we had a lot more upside. You couldn't buy the Post in 95% or 99% of the United States. So for us, if we could get our journalism to you online, that was an upside for us. Whereas the other papers all had the problem of anywhere in the country you could go to their website for free. You actually could buy the paper. So there's a little bit more of let's hold back and let's not go too headfirst into the web, because it's going to cut into our business model in print. So we actually really were pretty aggressive right from the start, and I think that helped us build up a pretty good reputation and a pretty good base in traffic and in uniques, which we've carried to this day. I think we've evolved. We think we've evolved relatively quickly, but we haven't evolved as quickly as we should have in some ways. I think you look back at the history of the web and you think of some of the things that newspapers could have done that other people basically did on top of us. And I always look history, go back and say, if one of us had decided that we wanted to be the Drudge Report, we probably could have been in 1996. Before Drudge launched, we could have been a site. It could have been us, could have been the Times, could have been any journalism site, could have realized that the power of the web is about connecting things, and that we could have put out every day, here are the 20 things on the web that you ought to read today, regardless of whether we produce them or not. But you have to remember that people who came out of the media world were hyper-competitive, didn't want to deal with any other news organizations. They just had no interest. So our attitude was point to the New York Times. How could we why would we do that? Why would we let people know that the New York Times has its own website, as if they wouldn't have figured that out on their own anyway? So meanwhile, Drudge goes and builds an entire website and an entire, I'm not sure how much of a revenue model, but certainly a big traffic base on top of all the newspapers, and some of us could have taken that if we had really thought through it. But for us, I think our philosophy in the last, and just to wrap the career thing, I did leave for a couple of years to go to AOL, came back in late '04 to be executive editor of the website. And I think when I came back, there was a sense that, and part of the reason I left in '99, to be honest, was it was very hard, if any of you have worked at online newspapers, very, very frustrating when you're working in the medium that you believe is the future, and you're dealing with a lot of people at the newspaper who want nothing to do with it, don't want to give any time, don't want to give any effort, and if they're going to do anything for that website, expect to be paid a significant amount of money. And so there was a general frustration of a lot of us at WashingtonPost.com back in '99 that if you really wanted to do web journalism, you had to go someplace where there wasn't a newspaper or a television station or a radio station attached to it, because then the sort of defense of the old business wouldn't be there. So what was great about coming back in '04 was that it really lifted. In the years I was at AOL, you came back to a newspaper where pretty much every journalist in the room understood the web web was a key part of the future, and if we didn't succeed on the web, we were in serious trouble. So it was much easier to come back into the job, and to walk into that newsroom the first time and have people coming up with ideas for what they wanted to do on the web was sort of what I wish had happened in '99, but things happen on their own schedule. And I got back in '04, there was much more of an appetite to try pretty much everything. So the philosophy we tried to adopt at the time was you have to be risk averse on the web in a lot of ways, especially if you're an older media company like the Post or the New York Times. You have to push and you have to try things that are outside of your comfort zone, because comfort zones can be quite attractive, and they can be sort of easy traps to fall into and not to try new things. So we came back with this attitude of, we're not just going to be on the web, we're going to try to be of the web. We're going to take advantage of the medium. We're not just going to take the 200 stories that are in the newspaper today, plop them online, and hope people come and read them. We're going to try to make them engaging. We're going to try different storytelling forms. We're going to try to connect readers to each other. And that's what we've tried to do over the last 5 years. And the way we generally look at it is, one of 5 things, and preferably multiple of these 5 things, have to be present for us to really put a lot of web effort into any news story. There are a lot of news stories that are important news stories, but realistically on the web, there's not a whole lot you can do with them. And some of the examples are, for a long time, it's very hard to do a lot with business stories. Maybe let's take the last 6 months out of play here, because obviously the world is turned upside down. But on the web, you can do a lot of database-driven stuff with business stories, but not a great video storytelling form in a lot of cases. So we try to apply to each subject area and each story that comes up what's the best way to tell it. And the 5 areas we really focus on are, I don't think any of these will be shocks, but there's obviously multimedia storytelling. I mean, it's a great opportunity for people who have been in print for their whole career to suddenly be able to carry a video camera around, or have a videographer go with them to get a hold of the dimension of a subject of a story, to be able to actually capture breaking news on video. So we've pushed really hard into multimedia, and it falls into a lot of different categories. I'll fire some of them up, but outside of just doing the breaking news, one of the other things, and Richard alluded to this, look at that, it came right up. I'm sure that's a coincidence. Now if I search in here, I assume I'm searching Google. This is the great thing. We even use Google to search for stuff that once lived on our site. But in terms of talking about, how can we do things differently? One of the things that we're trying to do is try to convince people that storytelling doesn't have to be sort of one thing or the other. It can be a combination of a lot of different things. This is an example where it's called Pearls Before Breakfast. Gene Weingarten, who's a great writer for the magazine at the Post, came up with this great story to why don't we test out how numb people are in their daily life of going to work by getting one of the world's great violin players to go into the metro station on a regular weekday morning and just play for about 45 minutes some of the most complicated works known to man and see if any of the people on their way to work would notice. So the original story was, well, we'll have a videographer. Why don't you have a videographer come with me, and then we can kind of, you can interview him before, you can interview him after. And we kind of looked at a bunch of different ways to tell the story and came back and said, actually, the best way to tell the story is just to videotape this thing from the corner, as opposed to just, let's hide a camera somewhere with the help of the DC Metro folks. We basically hid a camera behind a security camera and filmed this entire event. And of course, nobody stopped and paid attention to him. Everybody just kind of blew on by, and he actually made like $30, which isn't bad for an hour. So people seemed to think he was good, but didn't want to stop and listen to him for very long. But as we were trying to figure out how to tell the story, we really pushed hard for, don't just put the video alongside the story, put the video in the story. Whenever something happens in the story that you have on video, just insert the video there. And the whole idea of this is read the story, watch the video. Read more of the story, watch a video. Like, you're supposed to experience the print and video pieces of this in sequence. You're not supposed to read the story and then watch the whole video. So as we went through this, we captured this entire thing. And at any point where there was really an area where we felt like we should put the video in, we put the video in. And so I don't know if the sound is on with this, but you can see how good the guy is. And obviously there's more toward the end, because that's when you get into his actually being in the, this is not my machine, so I'm missing the page down somewhere, I'm sure, but it'll take me a little while to get there. But you'll hear how good he was. It is ludicrous that people would not stop.
He was playing Stradivarius, wasn't
he? Yeah, he's playing a $3 million Stradivarius. I'm just trying to page down. I'm sorry, I'm missing. Oh, this is the sound piece. Sorry. Thanks. Listen to how good this music is. It's kind of frightening. And just to show how few people were stopping, we actually sped the video up so you could see how few actually were stopping. You can see, not a lot of... And so he was writing about this one guy who actually came back and is now leaning against the wall and kind of keeps looking around like he thinks, how can nobody be stopping? And so there's a couple of clips in here of one woman who actually recognized him, and I'm sure it was the most confused person in the entire place, who just said, just seen him at the Library of Congress 3 days earlier, and was probably wondering why he was playing in a metro stop 3 nights later. So she talks about the end like, this is the only could happen in Washington. I see Josh Bell playing in a metro station. But this ended up winning Gene Weingarten a Pulitzer. And one of the reasons he won the Pulitzer, according to the judges, was that the web presentation of this really told the story and allowed you to experience it in a couple of different dimensions. It wasn't just reading a great piece. And Gene himself said he doesn't think he would have, he's not sure he would have won it if the web piece wasn't there, because it allowed this whole story to be seen in another light. So those are the kind of storytelling devices we're trying to do more of. We do some of this stuff in the news space too. If you look at a State of the Union story, for example, why, if you're putting a State of the Union story up on the website, should you just put text quotes of what Bush said or what Obama will say next year? Why not show him saying it? Because inflection and how somebody says something and where they put the emphasis in the sentence actually means a lot, but can't be read if you're just reading the quote itself. So with a lot of analyses pieces, now we'll just embed the video in the story when you get to the point where they're analyzing this particular quote. We'll let you see them say it as opposed to trying to read into what's just purely a text quote. Another area we've really pushed into is just letting people tell their own stories. And I'll show, for a couple minutes, I'll show one more thing. And then this one is worth watching, though, to be honest. This guy is... We did something called On Being, which is finding local residents who had interesting stories to tell and just letting them tell their stories. There's a reporter who's interviewing them, who's asking questions. But you never hear her, you never see her when she actually cuts the video. So let's go to this, my guy here. This guy, so they can be about anything. And this guy, the irony is, let me scroll off him for a second. This guy we went to talk to because he had a really close relationship with his mother. And he's going to talk about how tight he was with his mother. And then when the when Jen got there, she started realizing this guy was much more interesting in another way. So this is Sam.
I'm a really nice guy. I'm really easy to deal with, and I'm really low maintenance. But there are things that just kind of just crawl under my skin, and I don't. Sometimes I can't really deal. Crowded elevators. If you're going up 15 floors and someone gets on the elevator and is going up one floor, and then you pick somebody up on that floor that goes up a floor, take the stairs. I just think that's a waste of elevator resources, if you will. A coffee machine's jammed or it runs out of paper, and it says toner low. When Starbucks gives you your cup of coffee and they don't put the lid like sufficiently on the top of the cup, and there's just a little bitty leak. And then you take a drink and you don't notice and it drips down on your shirt. And then like 30 minutes later you look down and you just have a coffee stained shirt. It's just absolutely disgusting. And I hate that. And all that baristas or whatever those people are have to do is just put the cap on sufficiently. I guess when people don't listen and think about what you're asking them to do, however simple the responsibility, that's a little annoying too. I went in this guy's office and I said, okay, what's the problem? He said, there's a problem with my membership payments. And he said, yeah, Mr. New, we've been getting these checks in the mail. I said, okay. He said, these checks are coming from Bank of America and they have your name and your membership number on them. And I said, yeah, I just set up online bill pay from Bank of America. And he said, well, Mr. New, the funny thing is, these checks that we've been getting are in the exact amount of your membership dues. And I said, yeah, that's my payment every month for my membership. And this guy looks at me and he says, well, Mr. New, with all due respect, I've been in the fitness industry for 5.5 years and I have never seen checks like this. And at this point, I'm just really frustrated because I've had a long day and I don't know what to say to this guy. And I said, okay, well, first of all, that was not an appropriate use of the phrase, with all due respect. That doesn't make any sense in that context. Number two, I set up you as a vendor in my online bill pay system. This guy's acting like I'm a complete idiot, and he keeps telling me, Mr. New, you need to calm down. He's giving me that stuff. And I said, I'm really, really frustrated. I don't understand why you don't get this. And I said, okay, let's fix this. Let's just walk through the process and let's get everything squared away. It's like, I think that's what we need to do, and I think you need to calm down. And he keeps giving me that. And, okay, fine, I'll calm down, gym manager guy. So finally, I discontinued the online bill pay because, this guy just couldn't handle it or whatever, and I wrote a check every month. I can be a pain in the ass. I'll be the first to admit that. Some people might use the word neurotic, but I'm also, like I said, I'm a really, really nice guy, and I think I'm fairly easy to deal with. Some people really like me, some people really don't. It's just the way it is.
So they're always something, and Sam ended up just being particular because all he did was complain about little things for like an hour, and they really never even got around to talking about anything else. But we did these. We launched one of these a week for basically a year. It always launched about same time in the morning on Wednesday, and people would just go bananas if we didn't have this thing up in time. If we went up an hour late, or we took a week off, or if Jen Crandall, who's the talented videographer who did this a couple of times, did outtakes from other. It's kind of like whenever Seinfeld did his clip show, nobody likes clip shows. So they didn't really like her clip shows either. So, and it went on hold for most of 2008 for selection stuff, but comes back in January again. And it ran the gamut. It was this guy just talking about being annoyed by things. It was someone relocated from Katrina, talking about how he didn't realize how much of a racist he actually was until he moved up here, or moved to DC. And we sort of realized that a lot of the things that he took for granted living in New Orleans just weren't acceptable outside of New Orleans. So they can be poignant, they can be funny, but it's always somebody just telling a story, and they're not famous people, they're just local residents, and this thing was a huge hit. So we try to experiment with a lot of different storytelling methods as well, so that's sort of multimedia. Second one is database journalism, and we're doing a ton of stuff on the web, taking advantage of the amounts of data that are out there that are easily accessible on the web, certainly more than they are in a print format. If you think of a 2 full pages of home sales listings or crimes listings in a newspaper, they're not all that useful to you as a reader. And even if they're geographically broken down to some extent, you really want to know homes that were sold near my house, crimes committed near my house. And so we do a lot with basic local information like that, then map it out on something called Local Explorer, which basically is, no shock, uses Google Maps like the rest of the world. We've also done databases on every vote cast in Congress going back to 1991. You can sign up for RSS feeds, so if you want to know how every time your representative votes on anything, you can get notified, so you can keep better track of how people who represent you are doing in D.C. We've got databases on campaign finance, political advertising, lobbying, all the way to recipe databases, video game review databases. And the great thing about databases for newspaper companies, because at this point we're looking for returns on investment, databases are great. You build them, if you build them well and you build them right, they tend not to need a massive amount of maintenance, and they continue to bring readers back to the site over and over again for things that they become somewhat connected to. So we try to push really hard on doing as much database journalism as you can, because it does provide, it makes the readers come back, and as I said, it's a good return on investment, which is, I know sounds funny coming from a journalist, but we are in the world now where return on investment for everything matters. We're not dealing with the budgets and the size staffs we once had. So I'll just show you one of these real quick, which is just the Senate database. So you can go in here basically and see how everybody's voted on anything. If you want to put in a zip code, it'll tell you who represents you. But you can also check out things like, if you just look at any actual, you can see who misses the most votes. We've even broken the database down, so if you want to see who doesn't show up to vote much, you'll find out that shockingly it's Tim Johnson who actually had a brain hemorrhage, but everybody else the top 10 basically ran for president at one time or another. But you can go to any of their pages and get all the information you could possibly want about Christopher Dodd, including a very large photo. Biographical information, roles in Congress, demographic profile, financial disclosure forms. And this tells you all the different votes and whether he voted with his party, against his party. And so any vote page, you can basically see, here's how the vote broke down. If you want to see how it broke down, click on that. It gives you the names of everybody who voted for. And you can sort it by a bunch of different ways, by state, by region, and then Adrian Halavati, who's the developer who built this for us when he was at .com, also put an astrological sign just for fun. And people have tried to read into that what it actually means. It doesn't really mean anything. But so you can keep the idea of the way Adrian builds databases too is to keep giving you things to click on. So the idea is you're going to keep clicking because every time the data is sorted another way, it sort of gets you interested in another way to look at that. So we have a lot of these on the website. We probably have 50 or 60. And the one that specifically we worked on that won this the Knight Award was something we did for the DC schools. As you probably know, if you follow the DC schools, it's been a troubled system for quite some time. Bad graduation rates, bad test scores. Leadership has been questionable for a long time. So when the paper decided to do a long investigation of the school system, we knew the newspaper was going to do a great 30,000-foot view of what's wrong with the schools in Washington, but we felt like the way to partner on this was for us to really bring it down to the ground level and be able to look at the schools in the DC area and actually produce a massive amount of data that would suggest how messed up the schools actually were. Oops, sorry, the wrong thing. So if you go to this interactive map database here, you could basically pick any, let's just go to a full list of schools in this case. Pick any school in Washington, and you can click on this, any one of these. It would basically give you a full report on that school as personnel data from the school, all crime reports listed at the school in the last 3 years, maintenance requests, urgent maintenance requests, things that were open and things that were closed, and you would find out things like there's an open maintenance request from this school that was put in July 2002. And there were generally a bunch of massive problems in the schools that were not being addressed. But the best way we thought was you can write the big story that talks about the big problem, but if you can take that data, you can use data to sort of make your point that every school has massive problems. So if you have a kid in one of these schools, it allows you to see this story from the ground level as opposed to just the big picture. Because the truth is the big picture story wasn't the story in Washington. The fact that DC schools have been problematic has been the case for decades. But the fact is we were able to tunnel down and give you a real bird's eye view into every school, and you could see the problems. So you can see we had health inspections, crime reports, repair requests. So, and this is, that's what we won the Knight Award for, was basically a great public service of giving people all this information to help illuminate sort of the larger problem. So that's databases too. The third focus for us is reader engagement, is we have to get readers talking to each other on our site, and almost anybody else I know who works in this industry, in the news industry. The way to keep people on your website is to connect them to other people of similar interests, and other people that they build a relationship with. Because as much as we believe at the Post, we cover, if George Bush has a Rose Garden press conference, we believe we cover that as well as anybody, in fact, better than anybody. But the truth is, lots of news organizations are going to cover that exact event. So what is the thing that we can bring to that will differentiate us from a lot of our competitors? And one is, if you know that there are a lot of people you love to talk to about politics on our website, that's going to make you come to us as opposed to going someplace else. Because that community, those people, that conversation only happens on your site. If you can connect people to other people, they want to talk to each other. And we've been very successful at building big communities on our blogs, in our discussion groups. And so we know that the best trigger of loyalty, if we can get you to comment on an article or comment on a blog or ask a question in a live discussion on our site, we're relatively sure at that point we're going to turn you into a loyal reader of the website. So we try really hard to get people engaged with each other.
Question about your previous topic. Yeah, question about your previous topic. When you ran this piece, was there any impact? Did the public officials get embarrassed by it?
Oh yeah,
Anything
they made changes as they always do when we run, when you run a major investigative story like that. There are always changes in the system, and they responded to the stories as they were coming out about changes they were trying to make. And if you saw the cover of, it was Newsweek or Time, I can't remember which, a couple of weeks ago, the new head of DC schools was actually on the cover, and she was not in place when this was actually done. So there's a whole new person running DC schools now, and she's made certainly made a splash if you read the Time story. But I think this story, among other things, helped illuminate the need for new leadership. So anyway, on the reader engagement piece, we do anything we can. We do live chats during major events. We do we do about 20 hours or 10 hours a day of live discussions, which are hour-long conversations between reporters, newsmakers, and readers. Today we had Alec Baldwin on for, I'm sure that probably is one of the highest ones we've had in a long time. So you get him to come on for an hour and just answer questions. And they are probably the single most loyal product on, the product on the site people are most loyal to are live discussions. They go in crazy. It's kind of like every time we try to kill a live discussion, it's like trying to take a comic out of a newspaper. No matter how bad you think the comic is, there are 1,000 people who read it, and 1,000 people who like to come to your newspaper office and hold up signs protesting the elimination of Mark Trail or whatever it is at that given time. So with the live discussions, we have that same kind of loyalty. So loyalty is big, because all online newspapers suffer from not getting people to engage on the site as long as we need them to. Now, some of that is just the nature of the web. People come, they come sideways from Google or from Yahoo or from Drudge or from Huffington Post or some other source, and a lot of them are just going to come to read one story and back out. That's part of the nature of the web, and you're not going to change that, nor should you try. But we are trying with the people who tend to come in through our front door to try very hard to get them to put down some roots. And one piece of data which might be interesting is 86% of the unique visitors on WashingtonPost.com are outside Washington. So our local audience is only 14%. Now that's a loyal local audience. Those 14% drive somewhere between 35 and 40% of the page views, and because of the classifieds business, drive more than half of our revenue. So it's a little bit of a, if you look at it from a strategic standpoint, it does give you a bit of a conundrum about where to put your efforts, because you have this massive national audience, but they tend to be less loyal and come less frequently. So what we've tried to do on the site is actually try to do a little bit of both, take advantage of the fact the web allows you to deliver slightly different products to different audiences. And I don't know if anybody even knows we have two different homepages, but WashingtonPost.com actually has a local and a national homepage. So if you give us a zip code, you actually, depending on what zip code you give us, you may get a different homepage. So if you give us a zip code that's in the Washington area, you're going to get stories about the wreck that just closed the Beltway, or about the storm that's heading toward DC, or the fact the Redskins lost one of the worst teams in football yesterday. You give us a national zip code, we're not going to give you that. It's going to be heavier on foreign news, international news, and it's going to be less focused on that micro news that matters if you live in the city, but doesn't matter at all if you don't. And we still have national news on our local page. We don't ignore the big news that's going on, but we definitely have a favoritism toward local news on that page. So that's been one of the ways we've tried to address the fact that we do have two very distinct audiences, but don't feel like giving up either of them makes a whole lot of sense from a business standpoint. The fourth thing we're pushing a lot into now, I think everybody is distribution and syndication, which is the field of dreams days of the web are over. Like, build a really good site and they'll come. I mean, you can build a really good site, but if you just sit there and wait for people to show up at it, it's going to be a long, unpleasant experience now, because there are people spending millions of hours searching with Google, or spending it on Facebook, or killing hours like I do on YouTube. And that if you don't take your content and put it where people are already spending their time, you're obviously missing the boat. So we have our own page on YouTube, we have applications on Facebook, we have our own presence on the Kindle, we have widgets that people can put anywhere they want, and we have an iGoogle, and you don't call them widgets, what is it, a gadget, right? We have a gadget on iGoogle, so basically the idea is let's try to make sure our content gets in all the places where people are already spending their time, and obviously we'd like to get them to our site at some point, but we can't build our entire future on getting people to come to our site without making sure that they encounter us wherever they go. So we're even on, you take almost every new device that comes out, we try to be on somewhere, even on the Chumby. Anybody know what a Chumby is? Yeah, the little alarm clock browser type thing. So we're on the Chumby. So the idea is, hey, if you never know what the next big thing is going to be, so if it's not a massive amount of effort to get your content to that device, then you should put it there. I think we all live in fear of putting our content on 8 of the 9 new devices that come out and finding out the 9th one's the iPod. So we just feel like if without making a massive effort, we can figure out how to work with new devices and new sites, then we do. So we're pushing very heavily into that area as well. And the 5th one is one that's slightly newer, and I almost put it at 4.5 because we're not sure how it's all going to play out yet, but we are doing a lot more aggregation now than we did before, kind of going by what I said about Drudge before, the need to not just, I think media companies across the board have to reassess what their actual value is. Our value is not only in producing enterprise and investigative journalism for our readers, but it's also providing access to other great journalism provided by other organizations to our readers. So the idea shouldn't be you come to WashingtonPost.com and we'll show you the 4 or 5 things we did today that we think are great and we hope you have a great time. There should also be a piece of that which says, if you're interested in this topic, which you probably are if you're on this page, here are 5 other things you ought to be reading in this space because they're good pieces. So a quick example of how we've done that is in politics, sort of one of our bread and butter areas, obviously, is we launched this thing about a month ago called the Political, actually probably 2 months ago now, time flies, this thing called the Political Browser, which doesn't seem to want to come up. Uh-oh. It's the first rule of all presentations. Something doesn't load. Oh, that's why. I did the wrong thing. Well, when it comes up, I'll show it. But basically, the idea is, I'll shortcut the politics front. So the idea of this is basically that in addition to, you guys, Google seems to be working fine. There we go. Sigh, what can you do? But there are elements on this page if it comes up that are here's the best things to read in politics today, whether they're from the New York Times, whether they're from the Wall Street Journal, whether they're from the Politico. Bottom line is if you like politics, you ought to read these 5 things. And it also takes advantage of what we think has got some value too is political journalists also read an awful lot of sites and they encounter an awful lot of content. And along the way, if they find 5 things they think are really good, then why shouldn't we let readers know that David Broder or Dan Baltz or Chris Cillizza thinks these are 5 things worth reading? So we're trying as best we can to not only use the expertise we have in the newsroom to produce journalism, but also to provide sort of a guidebook of other pieces that you might want to read. What? I could, yeah. Good. No cache version? No, that's because I'm not sure why that isn't working, but it's not shocking, unfortunately. But we're doing this in a couple of places now. We're doing this with the economy. We're doing it with the inauguration. Maybe, let's see. Come on. I don't know what's going on. You guys just do this to make us people up here crazy, don't you? Because I swear the site's working fine. But so these are the areas that we really are trying to focus in because, as everybody here knows, the newspaper business is in trouble right now. Revenues are going down faster than in some cases in circulation. Washington Post has actually done very well in retaining its circulation, but revenue is dropping faster than circulation. So we're trying as best we can to figure out how to stem that and obviously try to build new businesses online. So, and the problem is pretty simple. The revenue of a print newspaper is still far greater than the revenue to a newspaper's website, and that will be the case for some period of time. Obviously, as Richard mentioned, the power in the local market to be to be a major newspaper distributed to hundreds of thousands of people carries with it an awful lot of value that we derive by selling advertising and classified advertising. On the web, obviously, the whole model changes in terms of how people value what it is that you do. So we still are pushing very hard to try to keep people subscribed to the newspaper and trying to make sure that business or revenue stream doesn't dry up, because we need it. But I think we also have to take a bigger picture view and acknowledge that, to build out for the future, we have to figure out how we monetize content on the web, period. And I think if you read enough, you know that that isn't happening as much as it needs to be. But without question, this is the sandbox people are going to be playing in 15 years. Consumers are going to be consuming news online, period. So hey, look at that. Only took 3-4 minutes. But we have to actually figure out how to monetize content online. If we don't do that, then we have much, much larger problems, because I think there's a general sense that the newspaper business is, while the decline of it may slow, that it's going to be hard to see the newspaper business returning to its one-time glory. So, well, it's not really loading very quickly, so something's clearly awry. So, and I think the key is that I think the mantra we try to use a lot at the Post is that it's not about saving the newspaper, it's about saving the journalism. The journalism is the value that the Washington Post provides. The form that it provides it in can be valuable and useful, as a newspaper is, but it isn't actually the product that, it does not have to be delivered in that form to be valuable. And so how do we take the journalism we provide and make sure it's available in as many ways, in as many different formats, on as many different sites as possible? And I can easily see a day, and I think it's something that we ought to be pushing for, where the Washington Post is pretty much anywhere you go in Washington. We should be serving headlines and weather information to metro, displays at metro stops. I think if DC's cabs sort of evolved to a point where there's a lot of technology in DC cabs, if those of you who've been in DC know they're not exactly high tech right now, but if we actually get to the point where there are monitors in cabs, we ought to be feeding information to that. We ought to be feeding restaurant reviews and traffic information into GPSs that are sold in our area. So I think these are all the things that we have to start thinking about. The disaggregation of our content has to be, let's try to give people content where it matters and when it's going to help them in the position they're in at the moment. And mobile is one of the areas and mobile is obviously part of the distribution thing I mentioned before, but mobile for us is a huge opportunity, but it's an opportunity not just to serve headlines, because the truth is reading a 50 or 60-inch story on a mobile phone is not a great experience. That's really not where we're going to win in mobile, is by sending investigative pieces. We're going to win in mobile by taking advantage of the GPS functionality that phones will have going forward and saying, hey, you want an Italian restaurant near where you're standing right now? We'll give you one. So the iPhone application we have for our city guide has that. So you can basically see where there's a restaurant right near where you're standing at the moment that has a good review from the Post. We need to expand on that. We need to be figuring out, hey, why not sell alerts? If someone is obsessed with yard sales, why wouldn't we have them sign up for alerts that if they drive within 2 miles of an active yard sale, we should send them something? Same way with an open house or with any kind of event that they have a signal that they have an interest in. Why wouldn't we tell you that you're near one of them now if you have a GPS-enabled phone? So those kind of things we're trying to push into to really understand that there's a lot of information we have about our consumers on the web that we don't have in print, and that we should start using that to actually get information to them when and where they want it. So as I say, the core tenets of journalism have not changed, but pretty much everything else about it has. So I think we're going to keep pushing forward on that, and I think it's going to be a hairy next couple of years. I think if you read at all about us, we're merging newsrooms. One of the interesting things about our structure for the last 12 years is probably, if not the last, certainly among the last of the large newspapers, freestanding newsrooms, which is the web newsroom reports up completely, until a couple of months ago, actually. We now are under one editor, but until Marcus Brauckley was hired, the website newsroom and the print newsroom reported up completely separately into Don Graham. And the idea being that, we had a little bit of independence to kind of go off and launch things and try new things that the newspaper probably wasn't going to be comfortable with. And I think that model worked really well for us because there was a sort of a natural checks and balances that came with it. And the best example, when I got the job in late '04, the people in the newsroom were just appalled that we were going to launch blogs on WashingtonPost.com. Imagine the idea of blogs being a controversial topic, but in newsrooms, the word blog in late 2004 was synonymous with some crazy person in their underwear sitting in their basement spouting off about crap they didn't know anything about. And you spend a lot of time trying to make the point. A blog is a format, is a way to deliver information, and is what you put in. It's saying blogs are crap to me was like saying broadsheet is crap. It's just a delivery mechanism. What you put in the broadsheet, what you put in the blog is what makes it valuable or not valuable. So that was a battle that we fought early on. We launched blogs on the site, and now we have about 90 of them, and they're huge traffic drivers, huge drivers of return visits, huge drivers of connections to the personalities that write them. So that was one that took a little bit of pushing. Might not have ever launched, or not ever, certainly by now we would have probably caught on to the blog thing, but I think it would have taken a little while for us to have really pushed into it because there was a lot of resistance. The second example was comments on articles. I understand the sentiment. Reporters don't necessarily like the ability of people to write that their article stinks publicly on their own website. Or it stinks is the nicer side. They can be a little more heated than that. So the idea is people already are discussing Washington Post journalism all over the web, but they're doing it on other people's sites. Why wouldn't we want that conversation to be on our own site where, one, we get the page views, we get the revenue, and we can respond much more easily than we can respond on somebody else's blog or somebody else's site. So it allows us to have the conversation, but also participate in it with less fear. And so we launched comments on articles, and that for about a year was a really touchy topic because monitoring comments on articles is not a lot of fun. It can really crush your faith in humanity if you read enough comments on articles for a while. You realize that most of the people that are in there are generally trying to do the right thing, but they all fall victim to the bad instinct to respond to the craziest people and continue to tell them publicly how crazy they are, which you should really just ignore them. But hey, so you have to spend a lot of time cleaning up comments on articles, but in those comments there are tips for reporters, there are corrections to articles, there are new sources that can be developed. There's a huge amount of journalistic upside to comments on articles and comments on blogs, and you have to dig in there because there's actually gold in there somewhere. You just have to dig through, unfortunately, some stuff sometimes that isn't so much fun. But the tools are getting better in comments now. You can sort them a variety of different ways. People can recommend good comments. Obviously, what you're seeing with a lot of companies that do identity sort of validation, you can sort people who decide to get their identity validated, sort their comments higher. So that's going to be less of a problem over time. But again, the commenting piece is really big, and I don't know if we would have been able to launch that. I'm not sure we could have pushed that hard enough if we were still in the same newsroom. So I think it worked really well for a while, but now, kind of circling back to what I said before, so many people at the newspaper are dying to do stuff for the web. The fact that we're separate organizations and in fact are in Virginia when the newspaper is in downtown DC has just made it really hard for us to advance much farther. That you have 650 really eager journalists in DC, and you've got 100 people who are thrilled that they're finally really engaged with the website across the river in Arlington. So we're putting it all together now and getting in one building sometime over the next year, and we'll see what comes out of that, but I think that's going to be the jolt kind of, or the move that we really needed to make to get us to the next level journalistically. So that's going to be the big effort this year, is figuring out how to take these two cultures, which, while sharing a lot of the same values, are coming from different perspectives and where media is going and what they've been doing in their own personal careers for the last 10 years. So that's the big challenge that's ahead of us, but at this point, we're pretty happy with where we are. We had our best page view month ever in October, which was 335 million page views, and we've cracked I think the 15, or I can't remember exactly what the Nielsen number was, but 13 or 14 million uniques that month as well. So we've built a pretty sizable business on top of that. It's just not enough to make up for where the print side is lost in the last couple of years. So these are the strategies. This is what we're going to try to do to get there in terms of getting through the next 5 years. So any questions or comments or anything anybody wants to talk about, fire away.
Hi, thank you very much.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you a question about applications for like iPhones and things like that. So I was the one in particular that I have used is the Times iPhone app, which is, to me, a combination of, a very nice application, lets you read the whole paper. In fact, it's retro in a way, right? You sort of read a newspaper again, and you do it on airplane, but software really sucks. And it just crashes and crashes and crashes. It's very frustrating to use. But in any event, so it sounds like you're not interested in doing stuff like that. That was the impression I got from your talks. I wanted your impression on, will the Washington Post have a better iPhone or smartphone app?
We have an iPhone. Well, it's not that we wouldn't deliver that. I mean, I think as part and parcel of who we are, we have to deliver the story. We have to deliver an application that delivers headlines and news. I'm just not sure that's our best play because I mean, for top news for sure, but I think there's a lot of things that are just not that easy to read on a phone, and I think we're trying to deliver a lot of utility.
Well, you can more or less read the whole paper the whole time.
Yeah.
If you let it load up
Yeah.
and go away for 10 minutes, which
Yeah.
is, if you go on an airplane,
That's
not a bad thing.
No, and I think as a niche product, that actually would be useful. I just don't think it's where we're going to put a massive amount of our effort on the iPhone app, because it's and I haven't used it. I used a time thing the day it launched, so I also may not be remembering exactly what it is. It doesn't look like the paper though, right? It's a standard iPhone representation of it though, right?
It's an iPhone representation.
Yeah.
But it works.
Yeah. Yeah, and we have an iPhone optimized site. It's not as deep as the Times site. We actually decided the first thing we were going to put our resources against for the iPhone was the city guide, just because it's a pretty important product for us. We had a bunch of competitors coming into the market on it, so we decided let's try to beat them out with that. But we do have a basic iPhone optimized site that has everything that's in the paper as well. It's just that the downloadable piece of it is not. We don't have what the Times has in a downloadable piece of it, but we probably will over time.
Two questions, actually. First one, are there significant demographic differences between the online and the print version at this point?
Yeah, outside of the obvious geographic, I think we're about 10 years younger on the website. Gender breakdown's pretty similar. We're still heavier women than men, but we're definitely younger. The demographic we do the best in online is 35 to 44, and then the second best is 25 to 34. So the paper's a couple of steps up from that in terms of its base demographic. Both are high education, sort of business decision maker types. So they're not that different outside of the geography and a little bit of age.
Another question, and I'm maybe blanking a little bit on the details. Maybe about a year and a half ago, we had someone in from the Washington Post who was into extraordinary coverage of localities.
Oh, Rob?
Yeah, I
Curley?
understand he's now in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
And just wondering how that ended up working out, and how it's tied into the current version of the
It still
Post.com.
exists. I think that was one of the areas we really wanted to experiment on, which was there's a lot of talk about hyperlocal, a lot of buzz about it. And I think our general attitude was buzz is great, but let's try something and just see if it works. So we in Loudoun County, which is a very tech savvy county in Northern Virginia, where AOL is and where WorldCom used to be, and is one of the fastest growing counties in the country, was a great place for us to start because they didn't have a long established local newspaper. It was really a good area for us to play in. So we launched this thing called Loudoun Extra, which was really demographically targeted. It's hyperlocal is a stretch because Loudoun County is a big county, but it was a very geographically focused attempt to cover everything that went on in an area. And I think what we found out is that you can build a loyal audience, but you have to be really spare in how many resources you put against it, because it's not scalable to 10 counties across the Washington region at this point. So I think we've scaled it back some in terms of size, and the traffic's actually gone up. So I think what we're trying to figure out is, we also included a lot more user-generated content in the last 6 months, and we've seen that help. So I think we're going to keep experimenting, but I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to size those local opportunities. I think the other key question that we're really trying to answer is voice. If you look at the 10 best or 10 most successful hyperlocal sites around the web, almost all of them have a real strong voice or two at the core of those sites, someone who's sort of guiding people and someone who people identify with and agree with, disagree with, whatever it is, but sort of a personality that drives it. And we didn't build them that way. We have a blogger who has somewhat of that voice, but we've put a very large, detailed site around that blogger, and we may try to aim a little bit more toward the personality piece of it, because I do think it's important for people to feel a connection to the people who run these sites, as opposed to feeling like let's be honest, a big production of a big media company. I don't have that connection to this is a big thing produced by the Washington Post. I really feel close to it. But if you can put a name behind that, someone who really people feel like is a watchdog for the area, I think that might be the model that works the best, and you let the readers generate a lot of the rest of the content. We have I was telling Richard over lunch, I live in Great Falls, Virginia, and I pay $50 a year for a product where somebody just delivers me 8 or 9 emails a day that are absolutely essential pieces of information about the town I live in. This road is going to be closed for a week because they're fixing a bridge. This coffee shop in town is closed. It's being replaced by this. Just great little pieces of information that are totally useless if you live a mile away from me in any direction. But in that area, it's huge. So is there, information and personality really matter. So I think we're probably going to focus more toward that going forward.
On what you're talking about here about localities, and I'm wondering whether or not Washington Post sees in the future them being some sort of a framework for localities and issuing some sort of like a site on how to develop user content. In other words, to train local reporters to say, hey, you have a story here, and this is what you might do if you wanted to follow up in a certain area, and how do you frame that so that it comes out and it's usable content and readable by other people?
Yeah, and I think it goes beyond local reporters. I think we all feel like if we can get citizens and counties who really want to produce content, absolutely go for it. I mean, I think there was an era a while back where there was this idea like there's professional journalists and then there's everybody else, and that only we can provide content that's useful to people, and that was a naive thought. We interact with people every day in our lives who have information that's useful to us that aren't trained journalists, so why should we put that same sort of limit on what we do on our local sites? So one of the models we've talked about in hyperlocal is finding really strong bloggers or residents who live in these counties and just turning over, saying you are going to be our blogger for Loudoun County, you are going to be our blogger for Prince George's County, and we will give you some resources to do that effectively, but we're not going to put you through 2 years of journalism training. We're going to basically set you loose in your town. And not to say that we're not going to want to try to drive them into certain directions about what areas are most of interest in that county, but I think we're trying to come to grips with the reality of the present, which is we don't have control anymore. And I think it's a really hard lesson for people in media to learn, and I think that we don't have control anymore of almost anything. We don't have control of the distribution of our journalism. We don't have control, you have to give that up. If you're going to produce a website that has content that's valuable to everybody in your community, you can't put that all on 650 journalists in a newsroom to cover an area of a couple million people. You've got to understand that there are people who can produce content and put content on your site or on their site that is useful, and that we either have to get that content on our site or point to it on somebody else's site. But we just have to kind of free our minds of the idea that we have complete control over everything we produce anymore, because we don't. So yeah, and anything's in play on that front.
I'm curious about the costs of the website online version versus the print version. I mean, what's the cost of the actual, production, of the print newspaper versus your bandwidth costs and stuff like that?
That's probably the total cost of putting the website and the newspaper out. The newspaper is 90% of that, and also by about 85% of the revenue. So it sort of equals out. But I think that's the thing that's sometimes forgotten in conversations about cost structure, is the newspaper is driving a huge percentage of the revenue, and probably will for a while. It also incurs a huge, significant costs, and they're fixed costs. This is newsprint and distribution, the whole truck network and the printing presses, which are very expensive. So the newspaper is, by and large, most all the cost associated with producing the combined newspaper website. So that's, and it's not changing. Newsprint prices have gone up a lot over the last couple of years as there have been fewer and fewer people buying into newsprint. So,
and do you have forecasts of where you expect those revenues to go in the future?
Oh, sure.
The newspaper around here seems to be a very thin veneer, especially this time of year, a thin veneer around a large pile of ads in the middle, and none of which I tend to read. And so I would expect that the retailers are going to wise up to that at some point and say, nobody's reading these things.
Yeah, no, we have projections out for quite some time over newspaper revenue, web costs, newspaper costs. So, I think we are in better, the Washington Post as a company has some things going for it that, not everybody does. We own Kaplan Educational, which is a really strong revenue driver for the company. So we're diversified. We're not all in the media. We're not in the newspaper business only. So, we own cable company that has mostly Cable One, which is down in the southeast for the most part. We own some television stations, but really it's the educational piece of the business, which is growing quickly. So we do have a little more, and more diversification, which certainly helps us. The newspaper is still pretty thick. It's still full of journalism every day. And I think that's part of the reasons we're better diversified. I'm aware that a lot of papers around the country are not in that shape anymore, and I completely agree with Richard that I think you're going to see dozens, if not hundreds, of papers go under or go web only in the next year. I think some will try web only. The Kentucky Post has already tried that, and the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin has gone web only. The Christian Science Monitor, for the most part, just went web only, except I think 1 day a week. So I think you're just going to see more of that. The cost structure is just not supportable for a lot of papers right now. I think, again, for the reasons I said, I think we're in a different situation. It doesn't mean we're not struggling right now because we are, but I do think we have a little bit more of a cushion than others because we've acquired smartly over the last 20 years.
I think we're going to have to wrap now. Thank you very much for the time. That point about the revenue, by the way, probably a reasonable rule of thumb right now is that the print product with newspapers, say like the Times, is about 15 times the revenue of the online product. So, New York Times about $2 billion on the print side, and about 7% of that on online. Now, those things will get closer together over time, but unfortunately, it'll largely be because the big number from print is going to be coming down. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Sure.